I just saw very sad Villanova news that Raleigh Massimino has passed away. Legendary coach that won the championship here back in the 80s. So I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot about that around campus. Sad news. On a much happier news about a sad situation, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the J.J. Watt thing. I just think this is one of the great stories in the history of sports about everything we talk about. How it's become so much bigger than sports, and social media has allowed it. For those who don't know, J.J. Watt, star of the Houston Texans, has been sending out these tweets with a website to donate to the Houston recovery efforts for Hurricane Harvey, and I just continue to see it, and I'm like, oh my God, he's up to $5 million. The power of these athletes to do this is just being harnessed right now in a way that you can't even explain. Think about 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. You'd have to have one of these concerts, or you'd have to have a telethon where people call in, or you'd have to, get TV time. You'd have to arrange an event. You'd have the Red Cross, you'd have the Salvation Army. But for an athlete to bring up this kind of goodness, oh my God, it's just, to me, this is a story that sports journalism, sports media, and even a class like this will talk about for years. I mean, it's been 2 days. He's up to $5 million. This is going to go to 10. No one raises that kind of money. So simple tweets with video of J.J. Watt in a hotel room somewhere in Dallas saying, please give. It's just awesome to me to see the power that athletes can have in this situation. A simple tweet to try to get to $200,000, and now he's up past $5 million. So yeah, I mean, I encourage you to follow his accounts, because over the next hours, days, I would expect this number is going to grow tremendously. He got the Tennessee Titans owner to give $1 million. Chris Paul has given $500,000. This is just an amazing story. We don't know how this happened other than the world is now flat, and with digital and social media you can do these things where you can make it so easy for people to click on, and J.J. Watt has however many million followers. All they do is look on it, click on it, and donate, and it's, we assume, helping thousands of people. Again, I know as well as anyone, people get cynical about sports, and the reason they get cynical about sports is money. And I think it happens in sports more than in other disciplines. I don't know why. I don't think people get as up in arms about actors and actresses making the money they do. I don't think people get up in arms about musicians and singers making the money they do. I don't think people get upset about movie stars and theater stars making the money they do, but they do about athletes. I have faced it my whole career, especially as an agent. People don't like athletes making the money they do. Why? I don't know. I think part of it is people think, I could have played. Could have been me. But a coach didn't like me. Or whatever. Or they're playing a kid's game. They're playing a game that 7-year-olds play. Okay. It's okay. I still don't get it. But this changes things, okay? Even the most cynical are going to have a hard time with this J.J. Watt thing. There is nothing but good here. I'm not a particular fan of J.J. Watt. You know, I don't care about the Houston Texans. But man, I'm a fan for life of this guy. Millions of dollars. Right now, immediately, like it's happening. There are no funds, there are no telethons, there are no drives, there are no concerts, there are no speaker events. There's no real estate that has to be used. There are no event planners. I mean, wow. So J.J. Watt is in a tweet, or several tweets, raising millions of dollars. That is the power of sports. That is the power of athletes. You know, there's Kevin Hart, there's entertainers doing this too. But Watt is perfect. He lives there. So I was, you know, when we talk about sports, I'm a soapbox advocate for sports because it's given me a great career, a great life, without having the ability to play, really. So when I see stories like this, I get emotional. I'm like, wow, this is what it can do. This is what it can do in times of extreme tragedy. He's making a difference. So we're going to see more of this, right? We have to. No one wants to see an event like Houston come again, but when it does, if it does, athletes have the power to use it like this. So kudos to J.J. Watt. It's incredible to just click on the internet every 4 or 5 hours and see he's got a new goal. It's just shocking to me how he is, in my words, activating goodness. Okay? We all have it in our hearts, right? We want to help. I think every person in their hearts wants to be generous. But sometimes you just don't have the trigger. You don't have the trigger. You don't have the access. You don't have a point where you're moved to do something good. And Watt has done that. Thousands of people have donated to thousands of people that need help through an athlete. So again, it's my soapbox about the goodness of sports. Any questions? Any thoughts? Okay. Now into the cases. Commissioner Power has really developed as much from some of the things we talk about, like the current events, but really historically. It comes out of sports. I mean, it comes out of historical events in sports is why we have commissioner and where the power has come from. So we start with the first. The first commissioner in sports was a guy named Judge Landis. And the first case about commissioner power obviously comes through him. So I think our first person to talk is Natalie. Pardon? Oh, who? Christian, okay. Christian, so talk about it and maybe some background that we get to this case, because that's the important part here.
Sure. So just to give a brief background, District Court in the Northern District of Illinois in 1931. So Milwaukee was a minor league baseball team that wanted to accept the transfer of a St. Louis Browns player. So like we talked about, they had to submit it to the commissioner and he had to approve it. He didn't end up approving it for the reason that both teams, and actually a couple of other minor league teams,
Right.
And one of the main factors in this was the player had been in the minors for a few years. They had a rule that the player had to have the option to be signed by a major league team after 2 years, and he wasn't given that opportunity. And they knew that other major league teams would have offered him $10,000, and they keep accepting offers for $5,000 because they were giving him basically these pay and sign deals.
Right.
So the commissioner did not approve it, and they filed an injunction against that. Not only did he not approve the contract, he absolved the player of any obligation to any team and made him a free agent if it was signed by whoever. So the issue is kind of, is the commissioner that given that much power and discretion in determining, you know, what is detrimental to the game of baseball?
Right. Can you explain where the appointment of Landis came out of? What incident happened that there was the first commissioner?
I'm not sure.
Again, this is way back, but for those of you who don't know, and most of you probably don't, 1919 World Series were thrown. It was called the Black Sox scandal, the White Sox, Black Sox scandal. The team threw the World Series. And if you've heard the name Shoeless Joe Jackson, he's still banned from baseball. So, as you see there, the appointment of Landis as the first commissioner in sports, and again, this is just background on the case, came from after the Black Sox scandal, where the owners are like, we got to restore integrity. The key to any sports league is you got to have integrity. You got to have public confidence. The public can't think you're running amok with thrown World Series. Think about that today, like a thrown World Series. Oh my God. I mean, this was 1919. Anyway, so the owners got together, okay, just like they would now, and they said, we got to get someone with impeccable credentials to restore the integrity of the game. And they found a judge, again, back to law, back to credibility, back to lack of emotion, back to best person for the job, a judge. And they gave him a lot of power because they needed to change the image of the game after this incredible scandal. So again, crisis. Crisis creates policy. Crisis created the first commissioner in sports, Judge Landis. So as Christian talked about some of the facts, there's a lot of issues that needed to be resolved in this case. I'm not so concerned that you really know all the facts involved. The important part is the judge in the case is being asked to determine the power of the commissioner to rule on these things. And this is where it comes out. You want to pick this up, Christian, in terms of how they ruled?
Sure. So they basically said he could rule in any way possible. He could take preventative, remedial, or punitive actions for any conduct detrimental to the game of baseball. And I think my favorite quote from Justice Landis is, I think he called him a benevolent but absolute despot.
Right.
He said it was clear by signing that agreement that was his role, and he sort of had whatever powers he wanted.
Yeah, it's a great line from the case, benevolent, and what was the second adjective?
Benevolent but absolute despot.
But absolute despot. Okay, despot like a, what is a despot?
Monarch.
Yeah, like a monarch. Tyrant, like a king. In other words, you have judicial authority, a judge ruling on a judge. You have a judge ruling that the judge can basically do what he wants. And really, he's blessing the power the owners bestowed upon this commissioner. If you look at the case, there's language about the Major League Agreement. Okay, so I'll read it with you. The jurisdiction to hear and determine any disputes between leagues and clubs to which a player might be a party, and in the case of conduct detrimental to baseball, that's two words we're going to hear a lot of throughout this course, conduct detrimental. This is the first time we've seen them. We're going to see them almost every case, right? Conduct detrimental. To impose punishment, pursue appropriate legal remedies. And here's the key, that last line, to take such other steps as he might deem necessary and proper in the interest, okay, not necessarily best interest, but interest and morale of the players and the game. Now it says the players and the game, but basically he's doing what he wants because he's bestowed this power by the commission, by the owners. And of course the plaintiffs are saying you don't have the power to declare a player a free agent, and in so many words, the defense is saying we have the power to do whatever we want to do. So such other steps as necessary and proper in the interest of morality. There's that line again. It's really it's the first, and the first is always kind of the precedent setter, but it's the first commissioner case, the first commissioner, and here we go. Strong, unfettered, really, power. These are broad, undefined powers. You start talking about what's in the best interests. You talk about words like appropriate and necessary. You think about how broad that can be. So, the Landis case, backdrop, hired out of crisis, hired to restore integrity, hired with impeccable reputation to bring that reputation to baseball. Given unfettered authority to do what he thinks is in the best interest, given that by the people he serves, ownership. Okay, this case is, whatever, 100 years old? Same things are going on now. Same things. Owners want a commissioner to have absolute power because that power usually results in them benefiting. So 100 years ago, same thing. Landis, as you see, was the first commissioner. If you apply it to the other 4 major sports, you see when other leagues followed suit, following the 1920 up to 40s, then the 60s, and NHL, first commissioner in 93. Okay, but this was a serious case in terms of setting the floor. As you study in your other courses, first mover is always the big deal, right? The first case on the issue. And what obviously no one knew 100 years ago is how much this was going to be expanded and debated in the future. I mean, you can't turn on a talk show and not hear about Roger Goodell's power, somebody's power, the power over players. Started way back, started 100 years ago. Okay, again, as Christian said, do you have the power to declare this player a free agent? Of course you do. Of course he does. He thinks it's appropriate and necessary, he thinks it's in the best interest, yeah. So that's the first. Our first example of commissioner power goes back 100 years. It's the first case. Okay? There are a lot of little disputes going on that we're going to deal with. We're going to try to hit the major sources of commissioner and player disputes, friction. As I said, the whole class could be about this, the whole semester, because it seems like every day there's something new. Not just in the bigger sports, in the PGA and the LPGA, in swimming, in tennis. Okay, the power of the authority over the players. Where does it end? And if there's enough of a dispute, we'll see them in court. Track and field. Okay. The next case I want to go to is maybe the seminal case when we talk about commissioner power, because it involved one of the most famous players in the history of a sport, in Pete Rose. This is Rose v. Giamatti, a commissioner who was not around very long. In fact, was really defined by this case. Here we go again, Time Magazine. Time Magazine's, again, not a sports magazine, but this dominated the news beyond sports, beyond baseball, for a year, a couple years. Pete Rose. Who's talking about this one? Your name? Mike Brown. All right, Mike, thanks.
So, Pete Rose was obviously a baseball player. Kind of his case was the Reds. And it was uncovered that he was betting on games, which led to the investigation by Giamatti. So, the case is soon after Giamatti wanted to have a disciplinary hearing, and basically they went back and forth from state court to federal court. They tried to go back to state court, but in the end, I believe it was the district court, Southern District of Ohio, said that Giamatti couldn't have the hearing until the Sixth Circuit ruled on a subject matter jurisdiction issue.
Right.
So Giamatti had to basically cede to the court and couldn't conduct the hearing that they wanted to on those. For
Okay.
a certain amount of time, and then afterwards.
And why was Rose trying to get to court? This is kind of like why Tom Brady wanted to get to court.
So I think I don't know if this was in the case itself, but from just reading about it outside of this, I think Pete Rose felt that Giamatti made a determination kind of before the hearing that he wasn't going to get, his due process in the hearing, so he sued to join the hearing from happening.
Right, okay. Pete Rose didn't want Bart Giamatti ruling on his case. He wanted a judge. He wanted to bring the dispute out of court, sort of out of the system. And the system is always commissioner rules within the league. They never have to worry about the courts. But here's taking it to the courts. And what happened, of course, is this ended up outside of the courts once again, with commissioner banning Pete Rose from baseball. Circling back to the facts, you said Pete Rose was a baseball player. Obviously, he was more than that, right? His resume. He was the hit king, the most hits in the history of the sport. So the reason this case gets so much attention is the magnitude of the player. Easily one of the best players who ever played, most hits. But you have to set up this paradigm between the two parties here. Pete Rose is kind of what's the word? He's kind of a mess, personally. He's a gambler, big-time gambler. He lives a life that involves a lot of gambling. Now, gambling on what? We'll talk about in a minute. Bart Giamatti was this different kind of commissioner that we really haven't seen since. Bart Giamatti was a compassionate commissioner. He was someone that was passionate about the sport. He was a romanticizer about baseball. You guys maybe know people like this about baseball. They wax poetic about baseball. They love baseball. They write poetry about baseball. Bart Giamatti wrote poetry about baseball. He was the former Yale president, and he came on as commissioner as really a fan. He was someone that just loved baseball, and what he loved was the purity of it. And if you ever want to read one of his poems, just the purity of the sport, and all the grass and all that stuff. Baseball lover. He hated Rose because Rose represented something different. Rose represented kind of the sinister element of baseball, where he was betting on games, he was taking shortcuts. Obviously a great player, you couldn't deny that. But you just set up here, you have these two extreme opposites. Rose is kind of a lout, kind of a guy that flaunts authority. Giamatti is purity about baseball. So anyway, Giamatti hires this John Dowd, to do like a Washington lawyer to do all this investigation into Rose. Okay? Doesn't this sound familiar, what's going on today? Washington lawyers doing investigations. And they came up with all this stuff about Rose betting. Now, Rose would bet on, obviously everyone knew Rose was betting on college football, he was betting on pro football, he was betting on basketball. The question was he betting on baseball? He admitted in the interview process he bet on all those other things. Dowd evidently had the goods that he did bet on baseball. Now, Rose's defense to that, and I want to know your thought on this, is that, yeah, but he only bet on the Reds, his team that he manages. So my question to you is, if you're a commissioner looking at the best interests of baseball, do you have a problem with a manager betting on his own team? And why? You were shaking your head.
Yeah, so like in baseball, unless you're betting on every single game, there's a lot of long-term strategy that comes into play. So for instance, you could be throwing bullpen arms that aren't ready for that specific game, and it could cost the team long-term. So it could in turn ruin fans' expectations for the rest of the season and things like that.
Okay, and you hit on something that did come out, which is he wasn't betting on every game. And I think you hit the reason, the baseball reasons why it's a problem. But anyone think that's not a problem? Anyone? That it's not a problem that he bet on his team? Okay. Maybe you do.
I mean, like, to an extent, I would say, like, it's not like insider trading necessarily where you know that your company's going to be acquired, so you put all the, you tell somebody to put all their money into it or something like that. I mean, in the end, it's these players playing the game. You don't really know what's going to happen. So having confidence in your team.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah, and again, tell me your name again. If Ben's point wasn't true, maybe more of you would feel like, okay, that's okay. He bet on every game. More confidence. But whether you feel that way or not, commissioners aren't feeling that way, right? You cannot bet on your sport. And Giamatti went after him. Case went to court. It went through all the machinations that Mike talked about, but ultimately it resulted in a ban. Giamatti banned Rose from baseball, and did it under this Article 1, Section 2 of the Major League Agreement. And here are the words again. Investigating any act to be not in the best interests of baseball, and to determine what action is appropriate to take against a club, league, or individual after investigation. Okay, this gave Giamatti authority to pursue this. And as I said, there was a personal issue between Giamatti and Rose that he chose to do this. And again, I think everything sort of comes back in the present, right? Why is Roger Goodell going after the best player in football and Tom Brady? Well, why is Bart Giamatti going after the best player in baseball and Pete Rose? They have their reasons. Some of it involves showing everyone else they're not afraid to. Power. That's part of this. Now, part of it's personal that Giamatti didn't like Rose, but again, you're going to make a statement, you make it with the biggest fish. Rose was the biggest fish in baseball at the time. So, the question in court became, can Rose move this out of court? And again, the answer comes that between individuals, the Major League Agreement must contain a clause by which the parties agree to submit themselves to the discipline of the commissioner. Basically, when you sign a sports contract with one of these sports leagues, you're agreeing to be part of the commissioner's purview. And then Rose was beset by IRS problems. He agreed to a settlement. And the settlement was that he would withdraw his suit and he'd accept responsibility and not respond to the gambling claim. Okay? Not respond. He would accept a banishment from baseball for life. For life. But he would not admit to anything. But Rose is the ultimate guy who signs memorabilia for money, makes a huge living off that. And Sarah found one thing he signed here. So he's not shy about letting the world know that he did, even though throughout that investigation he said he didn't. I went to Cooperstown one year. I was invited. I'm not a baseball fan, but I'd like this. Okay, I'll go to the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, the presentation. And I saw a sight that I'll never forget as long as I live. Say this is the entrance to the Hall of Fame. P. Rose's band, literally 20 feet away, maybe 30 feet, card table, P. Rose, signing memorabilia. $50 a ball, $100 a bat, $80 a jersey, whatever it is. But it was just so poignant. He can't get in the Hall of Fame, but he can stand right there. And again, listen, the thing about Pete Rose is, I'm going to get it. We're going to do a class about the issue of gambling in sports, which I think is exploding. But think about who's in Hall of Fames, right? Maybe people that had issues with violence, with the law, with domestic violence, with drugs, with alcohol, but not gambling. Okay, Pete Rose is a symbol for gambling that I think, my opinion, is really outdated. But we see what impact gambling has had. So, postscript on Bart Giamatti, he bans Pete Rose for life on like this week, whatever many years ago, goes to a Labor Day weekend to his home in Martha's Vineyard and has a massive heart attack and dies. And yes, I guess you could point some of his stress, a lot of it, to Pete Rose. So his commissionership was very short and very defined by this Pete Rose. Of course, Giamatti wouldn't have let him in the Hall of Fame. The next commissioner, Bud Selig, did not let him in the Hall of Fame. Actually, before that, Fay Vincent did not let him in the Hall of Fame. Bud Selig, the current commissioner, Rob Manfred, has not said anything about letting Pete Rose in the Hall of Fame. 3, 4 commissioners, all the changing attitudes towards gambling in our country, they won't let him in. Ty Cobb was a big-time racist. He's in the Hall of Fame. Okay. it's showing to me what we're going to start talking about when we get to a gambling is just the change in attitude and the hypocrisy of what's going on in sports. We start talking about fantasy sports and all the new rages in sports. Okay, rose is a symbol for gambling that is still barred, still like taboo. And it's just interesting, as Mallory said, what's going on with the Hall of Fame. They will not let him get, well, they will let him get near it, but only to sign. But he's making a killing, right? I mean, financially, yeah. He signs that like 300 days a year. All over the country, all over the world. People buy it. But yeah, the Rose case is a symbol for commissioner power and a symbol for gambling that has really managed to hold up the way commissioners treat gambling. Listen, what we talk about in sports is commissioner power over conduct. Usually we don't talk about player conduct. It's only been recently with Commissioner Goodell and player conduct. But this is conduct off the field. Well, you could argue it was on the field because it was about something he was involved with as a manager. But start to ask yourself, you know, if your favorite coach or manager in sports was gambling, would you have a problem with that? Let's start with on things outside sport, outside his or her sport. Anyone have a problem with that? If you have a favorite coach and they're gambling on other sports, anyone have a problem with that? Okay. We have a problem with them drinking. We have a problem with them smoking marijuana if it's legal where they live. And what I'm trying to bring out is where are your attitudes about conduct? Because with Rose, that conduct was deemed to be outside the scope. But everything is policy and precedent, right? So precedent, what do you do to the next guy? What do you do with someone that's betting on March Madness? Is that a problem? You're going to have to advise in sports law about these things. Okay, I don't know the full story, but University of Washington fired head football coach Rick Neuheisel because of something involving a Final Four pool, a March Madness pool. Would other schools have done that? Probably not. But policy and precedent, they wanted to create a precedent. Any gambling is not allowed. And I do think there are different rules for NCAA and pro sports. That's going to factor in. Okay, so gambling is really changing as we speak, and Rose is kind of the essence of it. Not so much the fact that we have this case in 1989 or 90, whatever it was, but the fact that he is still barred from the sport. Now, every now and then he'll show up at Reds games, right? You know, and wave to the crowd, but he's not embraced by the sport. He's not embraced. It's because of gambling. Okay, so when we talk about commissioner power, something that has become inextricably tied to commissioner power is what I call moral integrity. Okay, moral integrity in sports is something you would think as time goes on we care less. And here's the thing, I'll leave this with I want you to think about this for the next class. What do you think about discipline for off-field, off-court, off-pool, off-diamond conduct? because that's a big topic. What do you think about commissioner power over athlete conduct, not in the sport they're playing, off field, in their own time? We apply it to gambling, we apply it to sexual activity, we apply it to drugs, we apply it to alcohol, we apply it to political stances. Should we? Should we apply it to social media? Policy and precedent, we have to figure out where this is going, because steroids, performance enhancement, anabolics. Okay? There are sports leagues around the world where you can get away with a lot more. As I said in the first class, we live in a law and order society, and that is applied to sports. It really is. And my sense is your generation cares less about this stuff than older generations. And the next generation will care even less. However, I think among us, there are those who do care. Because sports law is now being defined by attitudes toward, or not attitudes, but power over conduct. Commissioner power over player conduct. There's so many episodes happening all the time. All right. We'll talk about some more cases. We'll bring up a couple of those episodes from the news, and we'll get into this more next week.